to the last session of day 4 of the National Wilderness Workshop. We're thankful for you sticking around today and hear all these exciting speakers and learning some new things. That last session about the Bridge Project was pretty fascinating, and it's wonderful to see their experience. Hopefully it can continue, and we'll be able to have more of those efforts crop up around the country. This afternoon, we are pleased to have a session on a topic that is of interest to all of us these days, and that's finding out who lived in our areas, trying to understand the history of place. So I'm pleased to present to you Andrew Downs, who is our board chair for NWSA, and Andrew will introduce our speaker today. So Andrew, go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, happy to, and thanks, Randy. It's really an honor to introduce Christy, and before I get to a little bit of her, sharing a little bit of her background with you, I just want to talk about, what value at NWSA we placed on having a learning opportunity like this. I think as we all work to steward wild places, part of that stewardship requires a really deep understanding and purposeful research on the history of the people and cultures who call those places home. And that really, it takes skill and practice and learning and understanding just to do the research about current cultures, about cultures of the past. It really isn't always easy. And so it really takes guidance and learning. So I'm really happy that Christy can join us today to help us all become better stewards by understanding the people and cultures on the landscapes that we work. Christy Hyman's an avid birder, an environmental advocate, a PhD candidate, and a brief worker in the program of geography at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. Her dissertation research focused on African-American efforts towards cultural and political assertion in the Great Dismal Swamp region during the antebellum era, as well as the attendant social and environmental costs of human landscape resource exploitation. Hyman uses geographic information systems, GIS, to observe to what extent digital cartography can inform us of the human experience while acknowledging phenomena deriving from oppressive systems in society that threaten sustainable futures. And I think it's a great honor, and with appreciation, welcome Christy. Turn it over to her.
Thank you so much, Randy and Andrew and Shelly. I'm so glad to be here. So I'm going to begin my presentation with a land acknowledgement. And I am coming to you today from Lincoln, Nebraska. So for those who call Nebraska home, we are on the native land of the Pawnee, Omaha, Cheyenne, Ogallala, and many others. And Native American Heritage Month is an opportunity to recognize and celebrate the continuing contributions of Native Americans in our communities and throughout the state of Nebraska. It is an opportunity to read the works of Native authors and poets. And November is a month many of us see as an opportunity to reflect and, of course, to give thanks. Thanksgiving Day in particular has become a time to express gratitude and to celebrate with foods of a fall harvest, and somewhat reminiscent of those at the first Thanksgiving, which were the Pilgrims coming off the Mayflower. But at the same time, November is also an opportunity to reflect and learn about what this month meant for Native American Heritage Day, and in particular, what it means to the people who were first on this land. And many of us remember making those pilgrim hats and tracing our hands to make colorful turkeys to decorate the refrigerator with. But Thanksgiving Day could also be synonymous with a national day of mourning, reflecting on the theft of native lands and the constant attempts to erase their culture. So as we give thanks, we should learn about and acknowledge the history and contributions and stewards of this land, the first peoples, Native Americans. So I wanted to preface my talk with that acknowledgement. So now I am going to share my screen. So I will go here and can you all see a PowerPoint?
Yes,
Okay.
ma'am.
Yeah.
All right. So let's begin with some truths about Native erasure. Now, this is coming from me as a person who is from North Carolina. So the vast expanse of Native tribes in North America is extensive. One of the reasons, and that's one of the reasons why we should always make sure that we don't generalize Native people's experience. So in other words, if you live in New York and the Native tribes there have a particular experience, we don't need to use that experience to try to explain the Native experience in Nebraska or Oklahoma, because it's such a vast expanse, and the resources that were available in each of the states in the United States kind of controlled the pace of Native dispossession. So I'm from North Carolina. So I grew up in a place called Scotland County, and it is south of Robeson County, which is known for having a large Lumbee presence. So it's important for us to know that during the colonial period, so we're talking the 13 original colonies, those East Coast indigenous communities in particular were impacted, and for many centuries afterwards, they were subjected to forced removals, enslavement, attempted genocide, forced dispersions, and subjugated statuses of non-acknowledgement. So if you think of, so what that means is that non-acknowledgement means that people are not being recognized for who they are. And people are, because of the racial categorization of that time period, which the most important thing at that time was making sure some people got rights and some people didn't, the existence of Native people complicated that kind of rough binary. So in the slides that follow, we'll kind of see the operationalization of that. So it's important to always acknowledge this, acknowledge that Native folks, a lot of Native folks' history has been effectively silenced, but that doesn't mean that the silence and erasure was sustainable, meaning that because of the oral histories and oral testimonies of many Native people, the culture survived and the people survived. So I'll go to the next slide. So this is from straight out of the historical record. An anthropologist by the name of Helen Roundtree did extensive work on Virginia natives, and a series of acts were applied to, quote, Negroes, mulattoes, and non-reservation Indians in the 17th century, so the 1600s. Many of them were barred from voting or holding civil or military religious service or testifying in court in any case. So that meant that Indian and free Black people working under indentures could now be held in servitude beyond the stated time because of the lack of citizenship protection. And then later in the 17th century, there was a law that was set up in Virginia to explicitly state the racial definitions. So 1/8 or more of African descent may want a mulatto, which is considered a not nice term. Even though it's a historical term, it's a not nice term. So for those who are new to this, even if something describes what could be characterized as a mulatto, you don't want to say that word. So what does this mean? You might say, well, what does this matter? Well, this is what it means. If Native people were not, quote unquote, the phenotype, meaning the physical appearance of white, then they were not categorized as white. But if Native people aren't recognized in a census, you're basically erasing what they are, and you're making them become Black. You're making them become what will be seen as a light-skinned Black person. Because what was going on was a need to separate the rights of white folks versus the rights of enslaved people. So Native Americans complicated that insistence by the historical actors in history who were the victors, the colonists. So there was no definition of Indian. And this laid the groundwork for the denial of Indigenous heritage in matters of racial categorization in the United States, and the myth of the vanishing Indian. And what I ended up encountering was when I worked for the Genoa Indian School Digital Reconciliation Project, I was able to examine quite a few historical documents. And some of the historical documents that I looked at, and this was for Nebraska, was in the 1970s. There was this push to document the stories of Native people. And you would read the transcripts of those interviews, and it was clear that the people who were interviewing the Native people were interested in learning things like Native magic spells and Native things that exoticize Native Americans. So during the 1970s, there was this push to capture the stories of the Natives because they're dying off, which was not true. But it just shows how the currents of history change over time. They have never been erased. Well, they've been erased, but they have never been, they're still here, in other words. And whether the recognition is a federal one or one that's recognized within their own communities, that shows that their presence is still very much here and vital. So this is from the National Archives and Records Administration. So this is another kind of historical tidbit that lets you know how easily one could basically erase the history of Native Americans. Prior to 1900, few Indians are included in the decennial federal census. Indians are not identified in the 1790 to 1840 censuses. In 1860, Indians living in the general populations are identified for the first time. So that's 1860. So basically the dawning of the Civil War. Nearly all of the 1890 census schedules were destroyed as the result of the fire at the Department of Commerce. So if we think about this, for the United States, you know, usually is seen as being put together in 1776. So that means between 1776 and 1860, Indians were not recorded. Even if you were one, it wasn't recorded. It wasn't a categorization. It was up to the census taker to define you. The census taker defined you. The census taker was not Indian. The census taker was not African descended. So whatever you look like to the census taker was how you reported. You didn't have control over that. And there wasn't even a categorization for American Indian. So that's what some people call documentary genocide, because for so long, American Indians were simply categorized as free people of color. So it was important for me to get the words of an actual Native person who was writing about Native history. That's important to me. And Melinda Maynard Lowry is a professor of history at Emory University in Georgia. And she writes, nations, both Native nations in the United States, are built on histories of mistakes, ambitions, luck, persistence. And as they are constructed, they are torn asunder by war, negligence, betrayal, hatred. They comprise the stories we tell about defining moments, values we fight to protect, people who made change, and places at which such change occurred. Following the Europeans on the continent and the beginning of their colonial enterprise, Native nations and the settlers and enslaved people who would create the United States have undergone similar cycles of rupture, rebuilding, and transformation. Whether one's ancestors sailed on the Mayflower, arrived in chains in Charleston or New Orleans, or disembarked at Ellis Island, San Francisco, or Miami, or walked through El Paso or swam the Rio Grande, this nation aims to become what we all work to construct and restore, a nation more just, compassionate, equal, able, and free. And Melinda is someone who is from Robinson County, you know, she's from North Carolina like I am. And she describes also in this same book, The Lumbee Indians and American Struggle, that when she was a little girl, it was Native American Heritage Month or something like that. And she said, I'm an Indian. And the little girl said to her, no, you're not. You don't look like an Indian. So for her, it was this moment where, again, her Indianness was in the minds of the observer and and it didn't matter how she saw herself, it mattered how the observer saw her. So that's kind of a parallel to the census taker in the 19th century before Indians were put on the census. What did they see? And how did that impact the histories and the surviving elements of cultural resilience in Native communities? So who wins and who loses? Who wins and who loses when it comes to land? This particular map shows the growth of the United States by region and the appropriation of Indian lands. So you can look at it for a moment and see what region you would come from. So it says the original 13 colonies in the right-hand side, 17th and 18th century. And then it kind of goes by chronology. United States after American Revolution, 1783, talks about Florida, Texas annexation from Mexico, Louisiana Purchase, Oregon Country, Mexican cession after the Mexican War, and the Alaska Purchase from Russia. These are the ways that land was taken from Native folks so that Americans could settle these territories. Because otherwise, what would happen? Everybody would be stuck on the eastern seaboard, essentially, and there's no room. And it allowed certain people to have a new start. But that new start for settlers meant relocation, removal for Native people. Who wins and who loses? This particular map shows the different reservations, the federal Indian reservations, the state Indian reservations, and other Indian groups. And one would think that this could possibly be seen as an exhaustive measure of all the American Indians, but that's not true. Some bands of Native tribes did not get recognized. I mean, that was the case for the Lumbee Indians for a very long time. They were not federally recognized. But that doesn't mean that the stories and the cultures and the resilience didn't somehow manage to survive. If you look at this map, you see the Shoshone, you see the Ute, you see Tuscarora, you see Waccamaw, you see the Northeastern tribes, you see the Tuscarora all the way up in New England, but they were also in Eastern North Carolina. And removed by 1715 in North Carolina. So even if the native tribe might have been in one place at one time, it could quite frankly have originated in another place at another time. So a case study in land cessions. So if we go here, let me go back. There we go. All right, can you all see the legacies of Native American removal? Okay, so this is a case study in land cessions focusing on Northwest Indiana during the 1830s. So this person, Kara Sullivan, has done us an amazing service by looking at land cessions that happened in Indiana. She begins by explaining how Indiana experienced a drastic physical transformation and how it was made possible by U.S. government's Native American removal policies. And again, it's reiterated that it encouraged white settlement in the following transfers of land, from collective to private. By 1832, the Potawatomi had ceded 3 million acres of land to the U.S. government through carefully worded and misleading treaties. So that's an important thing to also remember. Government policy, like the Indian Removal Act of 1830, it sealed the fate for Native American groups as the goal of the newly formed United States was becoming clear. Following this legislation, many smaller treaties were enacted, and by the end of the decade, the Potawatomi had been removed from Indiana. It's important, so our author here points out that land surveying was a necessary process in readying Indiana for settlement. The Land Ordinance of 1784 outlined a rectangular grid, and it was made up of sections and townships. The land was appraised, and descriptions were assigned like entirely unfit for cultivation. You know, the land was described, and based on the way that the land was described, it affected how it was settled. Surveying processes were mainly concerned with the land of agricultural quality. However, a lot of it was through trails or boundaries. And the surveyors who did this work, they recorded the information, such as the direction, in some cases, its origin or destination. So what we're looking at is the sale of land that was dispossessed by Native folks and then allowed to be settled by white settlers. And again, the justifications for Native American removal from Indiana rested upon the alleged inability to conform to permanent settlement patterns. So here we are with a cultural divide. Because Native people did not cultivate their land in the same way that American colonists did, the ways that they connected to the land were seen as basically irrelevant and not useful to the land. So here you see how our author has really pointed out different aspects and spaces of parts of Indiana that show how land was ceded to the United States through sometimes trickery type treaties. So it's important for us to know that these things occurred. Indiana is just one case, in many. Nebraska has an extensive case of land cessions as well. And it's important to know about these things because that's how we're able to read the landscape. If we drive up I-95 on the Eastern Seaboard, we drive past all these billboards and all these different shopping centers and stuff, but that's the land as it exists today. There are ways to know how the land existed in the past if we could only just research it. And for conservation groups who are interested in trying to develop partnerships and affirming Native folks, it's important to have this history on hand so that it can be known and so that these things aren't repeated again today. So I'll go back to this. So then I'll turn the page and talk about Indigenous sovereignty. Indigenous sovereignty is an essential component of civics education. Historical and contemporary examples of infringement on the sovereign rights of Native nations exist, in part due to the disregard of tribal sovereignty, nationhood, and citizenship. So I know right now we're in the middle of a cultural war. We got cultural wars going on, and you know, the whole critical race theory has become a hot button issue, and somehow critical race theory has turned into anything that has to do with the past, that has to do with people who are not white. And that's unfortunate, because learning the history of Native people is so important for knowing the history of the land that you're standing on, because they were the original stewards of the land. And it's really upsetting that this particular political issue has grown to the point where so many things about our history that don't seem important to certain people have become things that you can't discuss. So here's some keywords related to Indigenous sovereignty: citizen, confederated tribe, dual citizenship, government to government, indigenous, inherent, settler colonialism, since time immemorial, sovereignty, treaty, treaty rights, tribal nation. These are all important words to know when talking about Indigenous sovereignty. And the thing about indigeneity, and I'm speaking as someone who is not Indigenous, I'm speaking as someone who is African-American, who descends from the Gullah of Charleston. So everything that you see on this PowerPoint, I got from indigenous people who authored it. I didn't come up with any of this on my own. I knew I took the books that I learned from, and I took the people I knew, like Melinda Lowry, who's an actual friend of mine, and I went from there. But these words, the Indigenous sovereignty expands beyond just blood quantum, you know, being able to say I have this much Indian blood in me. It's also about being an enrolled member of a tribe, whether through adoption or through some kind of way that you've had a meaningful and substantial part in the life of Native culture, you know? And you can go on any social media platform at any time, and you could possibly see stories about people who are in trouble for saying that they're Native and they're actually not Native. But, you know, and Native people have particular opinions about that. And the thing about it is, it's not because of the history, because of the different ways that people lived, whether a white person married an Indian person or Indian person married an enslaved person, the colors of an Indian can run the gamut, same as with African Americans. So, you know, when we think about what Melinda Lowry said, when a person said you don't look Indian, you know, these are things that we must consider, not from our own standpoint, but from the standpoint of someone who is living in an embodied positionality as a Native person, what they have to contend with on a day-to-day basis of being told that they're not Indian because they don't fit a particular physical description that someone said an Indian looks like. So with sovereignty, the big idea, it impacts Indigenous people's ability to maintain their lands, languages, communities, and nations in government-to-government relationships in order to protect those physical and cultural lifeways. Making partnerships, making memorandums of understanding with indigenous tribes is not something to be entered into lightly. You need to definitely know this history, and you need to also go in willing to listen and willing to learn, and not necessarily being, in charge. I think a lot of times people have a problem shifting power, but I've seen it. I've been in the room. I've been in the room with Native folks when we're discussing something at a meeting, and a Native person kindly asks, if you're not a Native person, can you please leave the room? And I had to leave the room because I wasn't a Native person. But that didn't offend me because I understood what was going on. They needed to discuss something that was pertinent to the Native way of life, that was definitely going to affect them personally. And that's what we have to do. We have to develop this way of being in the world where we don't always put ourselves and what we want at the center of things. It can be difficult. I've seen professors who worked with Native communities in the Southwest. I've seen them cry. Good people, but they cried because they were told things that they had never been told before by Native people. And it was the truth, but it made them question everything they'd ever known about themselves, about their careers, and about the choices they make. So yes, it's painstaking work. It's very painstaking work. But I think, with the pandemic and the myriad of human experiences that have happened as a result of the pandemic to all of us, regardless of race, creed, I think that ideally could give us the compassion and the wherewithal to be able to consider these types of positions that we hadn't considered before. So let's move to Native people protecting their lands today. So I'll toggle back to here, and let's see here. All right, let's go here. So this is a map that's going to be very helpful to a lot of people. This map was made to show you the different ways that Native people have lived on this land for many, many years. Now, if we look at this map, at first glance, we see, wow, there's so many beautiful colors, and the colors kind of overlap on each other. But what this map is showing is the array of Native American presence and stewardship over time. So we could go through here and toggle and do it interactively, or we could go over here and do it by territories. The territories you see are territories that are not written in what, American English or Canadian English would write it in. It's in Native. It's a Native language. And it has the different Native languages that are situated here. So if we go to Spokane, it's going to take us there. And it's going to tell us different tidbits about this land. And if you were able to get this data somehow, I'm sure you can download the data set some kind of way. You could overlay this map on an existing map, and you would see all of the different places that don't recognize these things. All of this information you're seeing is not currently recognized in the United States map. So if I change it and go to, let me put this in. Yeah, so I mean, some of these they're in native language. So it's one of those things where it allows you to learn as you're doing. You're learning as you're doing. So a lot of this is in a Canadian context, but you know, if you want to look at sessions per se, you want to have a question about the session of 219. It's going to take you where that took place. So this is one way that we can look at land tenure in an indigenous context, and it can help us know who we need to talk to when we're thinking about doing things on this land, you know, because one thing we don't want to do is make decisions without consulting the original stewards of the land. There are things you can do, like look at that map that we just looked at, and acknowledging the relationship to the land that you're living on. Now, I'm gonna go back, and this is the language that's used in this website is the type of language that for people who are not yet evolved in terms of race and culture matters, it could possibly make them feel like, how can they talk to me like this? But, or it might be even deemed as radical. But the information in here is important because it's telling you, it's giving you a different framework of thinking about being an ally. It's called accomplices, not allies, abolishing the ally industrial complex. And this is an indigenous perspective, you know? And essentially, it's telling you to consider the following to be a guide for identifying points of intervention against the ally industrial complex. Salvation, AKA missionary work and self-therapy, it says. Then it reads, allies all too often carry romantic notions of oppressed folks they wish to help. These are the ally saviors who see victims and tokens instead of people. This victimization becomes a fetish for the worst of allies in forms of exotification, monarchism, splaining, POC sexploitation, etc. So that's pretty heavy hitting. That's in your face. But this is the kind of thing that I would characterize as perhaps as saying someone who, I don't know, someone who does a mission trip. And I'm not putting down mission trips. I'm not doing that. I'm just giving an example because they're using they're using missionary work as an example. But let's say you go on a mission trip to a particular reservation that's experiencing extensive poverty. And you know, you go there, you do whatever tasks are associated with the trip. And then you take a bunch of pictures of Native folks who are experiencing poverty, and then you put it on a Facebook post and say, look, I helped them, and then you don't think about Natives again. That's kind of stuff you're talking about. That is not what you would call a substantive, sustainable, actionable way of helping. They also talk about exploitation and co-optation. And they say those who co-opt are only there to advance self-interest. I mean, this can go across many contexts, but there are some people who are trying to advance their career. And if they see these types of things, helping Native people, helping Africans, helping African-Americans as a trend, or it looks good right now. It's good right now to help the Blacks. It's good right now to help the Indians. It's good right now to help the Asians. That's what they're talking about in that sentence. So this, I'm not going to stay on this too long because like I said, this is a very particular method. They're getting right to the meat of stuff, and you're in your face with it. But it's useful for people who are really trying to immerse themselves, you know, in redefining their relationship to marginalized people. And another thing you can do is get involved. Indigenous rights are being violated across North America. Listen to Indigenous communities and reflect on your motives. And listen to Indigenous voices. See, here's the thing about popular media. Popular media usually portrays marginalized people in very specific contexts. And it's not the same coverage that people in a dominant group are going to get. So if, for instance, I'll use Black people for this one. For instance, if the only connection you have to Black people is basketball, rap, or crime, it's not going to give you a very multidimensional understanding of Black people. So if you don't know any Black people and the only thing that has connected you with Black people is what you see on TV, which is mostly basketball, music, or crime, you're probably not going to have a good idea of Black people. How do you remedy that? You actually talk to Black people. It doesn't mean you have to talk to every Black person you see, but it does mean within the networks you have, are there Black people there? Okay, I'm not saying that a person should say, "You're Black, let me talk to you." You know, that's awkward. But I mean, there are organic ways. You know, sometimes you can just read. Sometimes it's best to just read. Read something that's by a Black author. Sometimes that's the best way to do it. Or engage in a particular organization that is for the advancement of marginalized people. So in a Native context, I'll use Nebraska again. So in Nebraska, there's this place called Pine Ridge. And Pine Ridge, overwhelmingly, the only coverage you get from Pine Ridge is the fact that there's so much alcohol being sold there. So what this means is that if a person doesn't know any people who are Native, and the only entry point they know to Native life is Pine Ridge and alcohol being sold there and alcohol being consumed there, what are they going to know about Native people? You have to have the type of mind that resists, you know, reducing people to the sound bites you see on television. That's why, again, it's important to read, listen to, and support Indigenous voices. This is not to say that Natives or marginalized people don't actually have the same hangups as people who are in the dominant group. We're all human, we all have flaws, but anytime one particular group is overwhelmingly represented by only negative messaging, that's never a good thing. And that's never a way to see yourself as learning about that particular group of people. So I've already looked at the map, and we've looked at the relationship. So there's another one that actually tells you how to be a good ally. So let me switch to there. All right, here we go. 10 ways to be an ally to Indigenous people. And again, this is authored by Indigenous folks. Identify the territory you're in and learn a greeting in the local language. That might be difficult. That might be difficult because there are Native people who are right now engaging in language repatriation. But you know, perhaps with some research that could happen. Listen to Indigenous voices, which I talked about before. Self-identify. If the lands you are living on are not those of your ancestors, you are a guest in someone else's homeland and should act respectively. You know, thinking from those types of standpoint. Also, don't support the erasure of history or problematic representations of the past. So that's, again, basically what I've been talking about up until now. Reassess your entitlement to the land you live on without getting defensive. The "but I was born here" mentality only further enforces the effects of colonization. Whose land you're on and what are the protocols in that community? Okay, so I mean, if you are privileged enough to be able to buy land, that's amazing. That's an amazing privilege. And that also means, how can you steward the land in a way that would be beneficial to the stewards of the past? And how can you find your own ways of giving back to the original stewards of the past? I mean, everybody isn't going to adopt this. To some people, they're going to say, what on earth? What do you mean? I bought my land, you know, whatever. And you know what? You're free to think like that. But this is how they are saying you can be a good ally. And of course, purchase from Indigenous artists, support Indigenous-backed businesses and local Indigenous creators. You know, those types of things. Take a decolonization workshop or anti-oppression training. Attend protests with a humble, helping spirit. And as always, independent study. If you're interested, that's a wonderful thing to do. And it's a good way to do it in a way that doesn't feel like, you know, you have to like confront or, you know, be physically around someone. You know, it gives you time to kind of grow into your learning. And it's also about Native voices to follow. Sometimes listening to the voices, it helps. It really helps. So here are 10 Indigenous activists to follow. And these are, a lot of these are young people. There's Autumn Peltier, who is the Chief Water Commissioner. Tanya Tagak. She's a Canadian throat singer and composer. A person by the name of Notorious Cree, who was a traditional hoop dance artist from the Tall Cree Nation. And Autumn Peltier, who was featured in the featured image. And so many others, so many others. There are others beyond the 10 who are focused here. These are the amazing Native voices who have managed to attract a great following. But there are likely some in your own community, you know? And of course, support Indigenous environmental activists. So we know about the water protectors. We know about how they were treated. You know, all of this is very recent history. And we know the concessions that environmental organizations sometimes have to make because of the power of money, you know? And you have to, and even though you think to yourself as a conservation org who is defending the environment, still there are Native folks out there who have their own stakes involved in these things. Try to learn about their perspective. That's very important. So this is where we began with this talk, you know. We began with this, with the erasure, with the non-acknowledgement. And yet and still today, you've seen through this presentation so many different Indigenous folks who are still out there fighting the good fight. So my hope for folks is to hopefully use this presentation as a way to learn more, not trying to force anything down anyone's throats, just offering perhaps a prescriptive to what maybe has not been taught before. So thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Thanks so much, Christy. And I wonder if I can ask some of the attendees if they have questions to put them in the chat. Maybe we can field some of those. And why we are, and why, while folks are getting their questions together, I just kind of want to reflect on what I got out of the talk, which was great. But it's not only, if we're going to be honest stewards and talk about the history of the land, cultures that have stewarded before, there's also an internal responsibility to take on some of that learning within ourselves, you know, kind of in respect to the land that we're working on as well. to think about how we act, to learn more and have a much more broader view and an open mind. So it's not just about this process, is kind of twofold. It's not just about learning about the land, it's kind of learning about ourselves too. It seemed like that was part of the theme of your presentation, which I really like.
Yeah, absolutely. It's
So-
definitely an internal process.
So Andrew, there's not that, we've got time, and if people want to make comments or to come in and talk directly rather than put Q&A into questions and answer, or questions into the Q&A, if they'll just raise their hand, we can recognize them and allow them to talk directly to Christy and yourself. I think we've got time for that today.
Oh, great.
So audience, if you would like to ask a question or add more to the conversation, just raise your hand. And of course, yeah, Pete, you're always there. Go for it, Pete.
Thanks, Randy. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Christy, thank you so much. And Randy, thank you for opening up the hand raising for an old one finger typist. Christy, thank you. And I wonder, I'm intrigued by the piece in your bio about your work around and about what is now, I think, Great Dismal Swamp Refuge. I wonder if you could enlighten us a little on that.
Yeah, absolutely. The work that I'm doing with the Great Dismal Swamp is twofold. One part is my dissertation for my PhD. I'm looking at documented instances of enslaved people who ran away from plantations that bordered the Great Dismal Swamp and settled as maroons in the swamp. And I'm using geographic information systems to try to identify hotspots in the area that could have served as refuge and reconnaissance for those enslaved people. Of course, the trading routes of Native folks who were there and who had inhabited the land for the arrival of colonial settlers is definitely important. So those particular Native trading routes are important to my work. The second part that I'm connected with the Great Dismal Swamp is through the Great Dismal Swamp National Heritage Area Act. So we're working with the Great Dismal Swamp Stakeholder Collaborative to make a portion of the Great Dismal Swamp contiguous area a National Heritage Area. And what that involves was talking to people who are from the area, whether Native, white, Black, Asian, whatever creed, and finding out how the Great Dismal Swamp has impacted their lives. The co-chairs for the Great Dismal Swamp Stakeholder Collaborative includes the Nansemond Chief Samuel Bass, and also a tribal leader by the name of Nikki Bass, who have documented heritage in the Great Dismal Swamp. And Nikki says that the Native folks who she descends from use the Great Dismal Swamp as a hunting ground. And also Dr. Samuel Bass, his grandfather was a guide in the Great Dismal Swamp. So people would pay his grandfather money to take them to different parts of the swamp so that they could hunt. So hunting bears or deer or whatever they were hunting. So yeah, so that's how I'm connected. I used to live in Edenton, North Carolina. And Edenton is in Chowan County. And it's not, all of that place is rural, all of it is rural. And when I would drive up to Norfolk for, whatever reason to shop, because there's more consumer activity up there, I would drive back at night. And when I drive through the swamp, it was so pitch black dark. And it was just like you're brought back to the desolate nature of it. It's so pristine still, even though it's, reduced in its size. So thank you for that question.
Hey, Christy, I have a personal question. If you don't mind, as facilitator, I'm going to jump in and and do that anyway. One of the slides I really liked was just about the language and the words that we use, what they mean, and why they're important. And as a white guy who wants to be responsible, learn more about this work, and share my my learning journey with other stewards and more. That's a point at which I've been nervous before at times to what words to use and and when to use them and what they mean and where to learn more about them and am I supposed to use these words or not? I mean, you hit a lot of that and that really resonated with me. And I just wonder if there's other places to go that you might know or recommend where just the language of recognition is discussed in a way that we might be able to capture and bring into some of the work that we do.
Yeah, so there is an actual portal for land acknowledgements, and there is also there are an array of journals. The Journal of Native American Studies also every issue is about naming and language repatriation and things of that sort. But what you will find is that it's complex and complicated because depending on the region you're from and depending on the age of the Native person that you're speaking to, certain words will be fine to use and certain words will not be fine to use. And that's what I had to learn as a non-Native person. In communication, in close communication with Native people in Nebraska. I asked a question one day to someone of the Ponca tribe. I said, does this matter? And she said, no, it doesn't matter. It was irrelevant. But I thought it was relevant because of how my own experience would have viewed something. And that doesn't help us, does it? It makes us feel more powerless. It's like, I'm going to say the wrong thing. So what I usually tell people is I'm listening and I'm learning. I'm listening and I'm learning. Sometimes you have to preface it with that or end it with that. I'm listening and I'm learning because some people, depending on the history of how a Native tribe was exploited or extracted from or erased, it's going to be different. I talked to Dr. James Raisin, who is Pawnee, and he had a very severe opinion of archaeologists. I talked to Matthew Richardson of the Haliwasaponi in North Carolina, and he said, I wish we had archaeologists. You see what I'm saying? So it's because he's like, we were so erased. I wish we had archaeologists that detail specifics about our history, whereas Dr. Raisin, because of things that happened with the Pawnee, he's like, some of them were grave robbers. And that's why NAGPRA had to be invented, because people were taking Native remains and being horrible about it. So yeah, it's complex and it's complicated. And it's just like with Black people. My mother is 74. She's like, call us Black, but a 30-year-old Black person, I'd rather be called African American,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a good segue. And I do have another question, Taylor, here that I want to get to. But I think a lot of people are also have a level of unknown and uncomfort or discomfort talking about into the African American community. And so if there's other ways and places like that where people can just learn the variety of words and implications, I think that something like that may be valuable to folks who might not have grown up near Black communities. And there's still a lot of places, in the United States where that's the unfortunate reality. So I'm glad to hear that those resources are out there for future learning. Taylor's got a good question she put in the Q&A, which I'll read here. She says, I work for a small nonprofit out of Tucson, Arizona. We focus mainly on trail maintenance and habitat restoration, and we use the term stewardship to label ourselves in the work we do. But could this be considered disrespectful to the original indigenous stewards of the land? labeling ourselves stewards in the context where they were the original and longtime stewards of the same land, and then have been, removed, obviously.
Well, steward is a pretty extensively used word, especially in environmental context, in gardening context, or horticultural context, and also in like new age spiritual ecological context. That word, it's almost it's like so universal. And if you think about when people use land acknowledgements and say Native Americans were the original stewards of the land, from a Native perspective, they occupied the land. It was their ancestral lands. So stewards in some ways can be construed as a Western word in and of itself. And because of that, I would say that is not a co-optation or appropriation of Native lands. It just means that you are in service to those original ways that Native ancestral lands cared for and developed a relationship with that land. So I think that you're fine.
Great. Other questions out there? Either raise your internet hand, Randy will see you, or you can enter a Q&A into the chat. I'll give just another minute or two for any of those to pop up. And not seeing any, I do want to take a minute just to thank you, Christy, for taking the time out to help us all. I think some of the resources that you called out are going to be really valuable in a lot of people's work, understanding the wilderness areas that they work to steward. But also, I think a lot of as part of that, a lot of the research you point out are great for people's personal journeys too. And the fact that those two things are linked is really going to stick with me. So I appreciate it so much.
Hey, Christy, I had a question for you.
Yeah.
This is Randy. So after the Civil War, my understanding is that there were a large number of communities established with the ex-slaves, and that those communities have become touchstones for a lot of Black culture in America since then. Are there some resources that are readily available for people to use to try to understand the nature and the migration of the ex-slaves after the Civil War?
Yeah, so this one's going to be very multi-layered, because there was so much going on after the Civil War. There was the way that Confederates were being, integrated back into United States society and dealing with that. But there was also what to do with the former enslaved people. So what ended up happening was enslaved people who were formerly enslaved, who were now free, most of them were put under the auspices of the Freedmen's Bureau. And there's actually a map. There's actually if you Google map of Freedmen's Bureau field offices, you will bring up this Google map that shows all the different Freedmen's Bureau field offices. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau was short-lived, and the main thing that the Freedmen's Bureau was trying to do for former slaves was make sure they got put to work. It wasn't about making sure they had a nice farm with a pretty picket fence. It was about making sure they were put to work, making sure they were put into a church, because most of the Freedmen's Bureau worked in collaboration with different religious organizations, namely the American Missionary Association and the Baptist Association. That's how a lot of historically Black colleges were established, through that collaboration. So what we have to understand is that after the Civil War, it wasn't about making sure Black and former slaves were elevated to the same status as free white people. It was about making sure that you could occupy them with work in the same way that they were occupied with work as enslaved people. And I know that doesn't sound very happy, but that kind of helps you understand why you don't see that much archival evidence that has to do with Black towns, except for a few well-known ones. Some of them like in Florida, some of them in Oklahoma. There's in the American Association of Geographers, there's a 1960 article called Pseudo Towns, and it talks about how you can't really how it's hard to document those Black towns that existed right after the Civil War, because these Black towns were places where Black people could live, so that Black people didn't live beside white people. So they only served one function. The function was to keep them segregated from white people. And what that meant was that these places were not centers of commercial activity. And anyone who's looked at a map knows that maps show us centers of commercial activity. So these places where Black people were relegated to, where they could live without being under the threat of, trying to integrate with white folks, they were just settlements. They were like unincorporated communities. So if you were to grab the USGS GeoNames shapefile, because geographers know about this kind of stuff, you would see that the communities are categorized in different ways. And one of the ways that some of these Black towns sometimes show is in the unincorporated communities. And how I know this is I talked to this really advanced in age Black woman from Pasquotank County, North Carolina. And she kept telling me all these places. And I was looking out, she was on the phone with me, and I was like Googling, I was like, I don't see this place, I don't see this place. But I wrote it down. When I wrote it down, some of those places emerged within that particular shapefile, the USGS, for the USGS GeoNames, because the focus of that particular data set was to document every single instance of landform in place in the United States, regardless of whether it was a commercial center of activity. So I would say this is what I would say for someone trying to find where Black people would have lived after the Civil War. Look at Freedmen's Bureau records. I think some of them have been digitized, and that's gonna point you toward the different work regimes that situated Black people. But most of them were basically sent back to former plantation owners' places who had, recognized the oath of allegiance to the United States and were back, back producing what they produced, but were rewarding Black people with free labor through the sharecropping system. That's a good question, but it's very multi-layered.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Randy. I think we haven't had any other questions pop in, so we can call it a wrap. But once again, Christy, as a fellow North Carolinian of Fuquay Marina, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Really appreciate it.
Right, it was great to be here, and thank you all.
No, thank you, Randy.
All right, thank you, Christy. Excellent. So brings us to the end of today and brings us into tomorrow. So just as a recap, tomorrow we're going to start the day out with a coffee hour. We'll have a participant survey for you to involve yourself in about how the workshop experience was for you. Then we'll be going into the National Wilderness Stewardship Awards that NWSA and SWS provide for the wilderness stewardship community to recognize outstanding contributions to wilderness stewardship, both individually, by organizations, and with agency partners, along with recognizing rising leaders within the wilderness community that will be our future leaders. At 1 o'clock Eastern Time, the Forest Service will be doing their National Wilderness Awards, and we'll be joined by Chief Randy Moore, who will provide us some comments and help with the award ceremony. And then in the afternoon sessions, 2:15 and 3 o'clock, we have Braden Brigado and Sean Babington, both from the House Natural Resources Committee and the Senate Ag Committee, who will give us the outlook of wilderness from the view of Congress, of what's going on currently within the committees, what's been going on in the past, and a chance for us to learn how to be better advocates to members of Congress and working with those committees. And finally, we're going to close out the day tomorrow with Jay Erskine-Lutzy, who is going to talk about the history of conservation advocacy and from the ground up, and how we all can be successful advocates for wilderness stewardship wherever we're at, and some of the successes that we've had in the past. And we'll wrap up the workshop with some notes about what's coming up in the future. We hope that you'll join us for the full day tomorrow. We thank you for being here. If you haven't yet had a chance to do our Wilderness Challenges survey, go find that link in your email and do that tonight so that we can consolidate all that information for everybody on Friday. And again, probably by the end of the day tomorrow, we should have all these recordings assembled and available for viewing for folks. So thanks, everybody. And let's go ahead and we'll close out for today and see you all bright and early in the morning.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.